Hello, my friend. If you've ever walked through an old cemetery just before dusk, you'll understand what I mean when I say some prayers never fade. They linger, like whispers between the gravestones, like footprints that no wind can erase. I wasn't looking for a miracle when I arrived at that hilltop. In fact, I wasn't even sure I believed in them anymore. But something led me there, a quiet town in the French countryside. A worn map folded into my journal, and a heart too tired to argue with silence. And that's where I saw her, a woman in black, kneeling before a tomb, still as stone, unmoving, as if the whole world had narrowed to that one grave. And when I turned back just moments later, she was gone. Only the tomb remained, and the name etched into it would change everything I thought I knew about death. Faith and grace. This is the story of a meeting I never expected, a presence I can't forget, and the sacred mystery of the woman at the tomb. Let me tell you what happened. Chapter 1. The Cemetery on the Hill. They say that when your faith begins to falter, it's not lightning that calls you back, it's a whisper, a quiet suggestion, a gentle turning of the wind, a feeling that tugs at your coat hem when you're too tired to keep walking, and too afraid to stop. I suppose that's how I ended up in the little town of St. Auriel. You won't find it on most maps. It lies somewhere between Avignon and the hazy edges of old Roman vineyards, tucked in the folds of a valley that has forgotten time. The train that took me there was late. The driver of the local bus was asleep when I arrived, and the innkeeper greeted me with a shrug that somehow said, "We've been expecting you." I wasn't looking for a miracle. God knows I didn't even believe in those anymore. What I was looking for, if I'm honest, was quiet. A kind of stillness that the city had robbed from me, one stolen heartbeat at a time. My pilgrimage hadn't started with a vision or a vow. It had started with a funeral. My mother's. She was the last living thread of faith in our family. I watched her light candles until the end, even when her hands trembled too much to strike the match. I watched her pray with lips that moved when her voice was already gone. And in the final hours, when I held her hand in the hospice chapel, she whispered something I didn't understand, something about a woman who never left the tomb. At the time, I thought it was just the pain speaking, or the morphine, but the words stayed with me. It was late afternoon when I first arrived in St. Auriel. The air smelled of lavender and old stone. Every wall wore the centuries like a second skin, cracked, warm, holy. Children played near the fountain in the town square, their laughter echoing softly, almost reverently, as if even they knew this place was sacred in some unspoken way. I checked into a modest guest house with wooden shutters and a cross above the door. The woman who ran it offered me a room upstairs and a warm cup of chicory coffee. I asked her if the abbey still stood. "Oui," she said, nodding slowly, "and the cemetery too, but you won't find many people there. It's quiet." Exactly what I needed. I left my bag on the small iron-framed bed and followed the winding path through town. Past clusters of pale stone houses and creeping ivy, the sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting everything in that deep Provençal gold you only read about in poetry. It was the kind of light that makes even shadows look gentle. As I walked, the sound of church bells began to drift down from the hills above. Not loud, just distant enough to feel like they were remembering something. Or mourning something. I couldn't tell which. A cobblestone path led me up past a row of slender cypress trees. Their dark silhouettes like sentinels guarding something holy. And there, just beyond the bend, I saw the old wrought iron gate of the cemetery. It stood open, no creaking hinges, no dramatic wind, just open, as if someone had walked through moments before and politely left it ajar. I hesitated at the threshold, not out of fear, but something else, like crossing into another layer of time. The air felt heavier here, thick with incense and memory. The earth itself seemed to hum beneath my feet. Inside, the cemetery was breathtaking. It wasn't large, perhaps 24 graves, most marked with tall white crosses or weather-worn stones inscribed with Latin and French epithets. Statues of angels leaned in solemn poses, some with wings chipped, others with faces smoothed by time and rain. Vines crept across the edges of the mausoleums, and clusters of wildflowers grew from cracks between stones. It wasn't morbid, it was beautiful and utterly silent, except for the soft tolling of the distant bell. I took a step inside. I didn't see her at first. I was drawn instead to a large stone cross in the center of the cemetery, under which lay a child's grave, Therese, 1932 to 1939. Someone had placed a doll beside the headstone, now faded and rain-worn, its cloth body resting in eternal vigil. That's when I noticed her. She was kneeling at the far edge of the cemetery, beside a narrow tomb overgrown with moss and framed by tall rosemary bushes. A woman dressed entirely in black, long sleeves, a veil that draped over her shoulders, and a shawl pulled tightly around her body despite the summer warmth. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, as she ran a set of rosary beads through her fingers. There was something about the way she knelt, completely still, utterly immersed, that made it feel like I was intruding just by breathing. I looked around. There were no other visitors, only her and me. I thought about walking over, perhaps saying a quiet hello or asking if she was okay, but something in the air said, "Wait." So I did. I sat on a stone bench, half hidden by hedges, and watched her from a respectful distance, not out of voyeurism, but something closer to reverence. It felt like I had stumbled into a sacred moment, one that didn't belong to me but had, somehow, allowed me to witness it. She didn't look up, she didn't move. The only sound was the whisper of her beads clicking softly in her hands and the wind threading through the trees. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and still she knelt there, unmoving, unbothered by time. Eventually, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the stones. I stood to leave, not wanting to intrude any longer. I turned toward the gate, paused for a final glance over my shoulder. She was gone, not walking, not standing, just gone. The tomb was empty now. No sign of the woman, no shifting veil disappearing behind a tree, no echo of footsteps, nothing. I blinked, stepped forward quickly. Maybe she had simply moved to another part of the cemetery. But no, there was nowhere to go. The rows of graves stretched in neat lines, the gate still open and silent. She had vanished, and then I saw the tomb she had been kneeling beside. The stone was older than the others, with an inscription worn nearly to smoothness. I leaned closer and brushed away a patch of lichen. Sister Cécile du Sacré-Cœur, 1912 to 1944. Je suis avec les petits jusqu'au bout. I am with the little ones until the end. A single white rose had been placed at the base of the tomb. Fresh. No other flowers in the cemetery were fresh. The others had long since dried or been overtaken by wind and weeds. But this one looked like it had been plucked that morning. And its scent was faintly of frankincense. I stood there for a long time, unsure what to think. It could have been a local woman, of course, someone who still remembered Sister Cécile. But there was something in my chest, a soft, stirring weight, that told me it wasn't that simple. I left the cemetery in silence, not daring to look back. That night, I barely slept, not from fear, but from wonder. Who was she? Where did she go? And what was it that made me feel, deep in my bones, that her prayer had somehow included me? When I finally drifted into sleep, I dreamed of the cemetery again. Only this time, I was the one kneeling at the tomb, and she stood beside me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. She said nothing, but her presence was as real as stone. And in her silence, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Would Not Leave. It's strange how a place filled with the dead can make you feel more alive. The next morning, I returned to the cemetery before the sun had fully crested the hills. The sky was still the color of bruised violets, and mist clung low between the gravestones like breath that hadn't yet exhaled. I hadn't planned on going back so soon, but sleep had barely brushed my eyes. Someone was pulling me. I told myself it was curiosity, but it felt more like invitation. The iron gate stood open once again. As if waiting, I passed through without hesitation this time, my feet already remembering the path between the rows. I half expected to see the woman in black kneeling once more beside the grave, her fingers dancing across those rosary beads like a silent hymn. But the cemetery was empty. Quiet, yes, but not abandoned. There was a presence here, something lingering in the hush. It wasn't oppressive, nor eerie exactly, but it made the air feel thicker, as though every stone had a memory to whisper and was just waiting for you to lean in close enough to hear. I wandered slowly, letting my fingers trail along the tops of mossy headstones. Most were carved in French, some in Latin, others so worn they offered only hints, half names, dates blurred by the gentle erosion of decades. One gravestone read, Jean-Luc Fournier, 1890 to 1918, mort en priant, died while praying. Another had no name at all, just a carving of a lamb curled beneath a cross. Likely a child. I found myself whispering a Hail Mary under my breath, something I hadn't done in years. There were statues too, weathered angels with outstretched arms, serene Madonnas cradling sorrowful hearts. Crucifixes leaned against the sky like ancient punctuation marks. One statue in particular caught my eye, a Saint Michael, sword drawn, but his face was turned upward, not in battle, but in longing, as if waiting for an answer that had not yet come. I was lost in these quiet reveries when I remembered the woman. I turned to glance back toward the grave where I had seen her kneeling the day before. She was gone, or rather, she was still gone. I don't know what I expected, but somehow I had hoped. The tomb was unchanged, at least. From a distance, no figure beside it, no movement. The breeze stirred the rosemary bushes gently, and a blackbird called once from the cypress trees overhead. I walked slowly toward it. There was only one path leading in and out of the cemetery. No side gate, no secret passage. If she had left the day before, she must have passed right by me. And yet I had seen nothing, heard nothing. It was as if she had been folded back into the earth itself. As I stood before the tomb again, I noticed details I hadn't before. The stone was pale gray, but flecked with deeper mineral veins that shimmered faintly in the morning light. The engraving, though worn, was legible enough. Sister Cécile du Sacré-Cœur, born June 1912, died August 1944. Je suis avec les petits jusqu'au bout. I whispered the line aloud, testing the words on my tongue. I am with the little ones until the end. A vow, a promise, and a farewell. The name lingered with me, Sister Cécile of the Sacred Heart. I could almost hear it being spoken in a chapel somewhere, the syllables echoing off stone walls. And then I saw the rose. It hadn't been there earlier that morning. At least, I didn't think it had. A single white rose, perfect, dew-kissed, its petals half open, as if caught mid-breath. It rested gently at the base of the tomb, nestled where the grass gave way to gravel. No vase, no ribbon, just a flower placed with intention and tenderness. I looked around. There was no one else in the cemetery. I knelt instinctively, not out of custom, but from a sudden heaviness in my chest. The kind that grips you when something sacred brushes your skin and leaves its fingerprint behind. I reached out and touched the rose. It was warm, not from the sun. It was too early for that, but from something else, something inward, as if the rose remembered the hand that had held it before mine. The air around me shifted. I don't know how else to describe it. The light didn't change, the wind didn't howl, but something tilted, imperceptibly, like the earth had sighed beneath my knees. I looked around again, still alone, and yet not. I stood up slowly and took a step back, the scent of the rose still lingering in the air, not just floral, but incense-like, frankincense and something older. Something like myrrh. It stirred a memory I couldn't place. A sensation from childhood, perhaps. Kneeling beside my mother at Easter Mass. The world full of smoke and Latin and light. And then came the feeling. A kind of release. Like the lifting of a veil. Not a dramatic pulling back, but a soft unthreading of something heavy and unseen. It began in my chest and spread outward, gentle, subtle, like warmth spreading in cold limbs. And beneath it all, a strange contradiction, awe and fear. Not fear of danger, fear of meaning. Because what I felt in that moment was not emptiness, but presence. Something, or someone, had been there, was still there. And I had interrupted a conversation older than myself. I sat down on the nearest bench and tried to make sense of it. I'm not a fool. I've read enough ghost stories, heard enough tales from my grandmother's rosary circle to recognize the echoes. But this wasn't a tale whispered in the dark to frighten children. This was different. This was holy. And yet, if you asked me why I was trembling, I wouldn't have an answer. It wasn't until I took out my small notebook, the one I carried on all my travels, that I noticed something odd. The leather cover was damp, not from the morning dew, but as if it had absorbed moisture from something recently held or blessed. I opened to the last page I had written and found, tucked neatly between the sheets, a folded scrap of paper I didn't remember placing there. It read, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Matthew chapter 5 verse 4. My breath caught. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant, slanted, written in blue ink with the kind of care you don't see anymore. I looked up, scanning the cemetery once more. Nothing. Only the stones. Only the wind. Only the silent testimony of Sister Cécile. Later that afternoon, I returned to the guest house and asked the innkeeper about the woman. "Have you ever seen someone dressed in black praying at the cemetery?" I asked casually, stirring sugar into my tea. She looked up sharply. "The woman?" I nodded. "She comes sometimes," the innkeeper said, her voice lowering. "But no one knows who she is. I used to think she was a relative of someone buried there, but the way she kneels, it's like she's guarding." "Guarding?" I repeated. She hesitated. "It is said that Sister Cécile died protecting children during the war. Some say she hid them in the crypts under the abbey when the soldiers came. She refused to leave them, even when she had the chance." I swallowed hard. "She was killed?" I asked. "Not by bullet. They say she was taken. No one ever found her body. Just her rosary. It was returned later by a German nurse who converted after the war. That's why they built the tomb. But how can there be a tomb without a body?" The innkeeper only shrugged, then looked out the window. "Some things don't need a body," she said quietly. "Some things are built to hold memory." I walked back to my room in a daze, that final sentence repeating in my mind like the toll of a faraway bell. Built to hold memory. That night, I returned to the cemetery one last time. Just before sunset, the gate was still open. The tomb was still there. The rose was now fully open, its petals wide like arms stretched in surrender. I stood before it, closed my eyes, and whispered the only prayer I remembered from childhood. "If you're still here, if you are who I think you are, help me believe again." The wind picked up, not sharply, but like a breath, and I could have sworn, just for a moment, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Warm, steady, real. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Chapter 3. Sister Cécile of the Sacred Heart. The following morning, I found myself unable to leave the guest house dining room. The sunlight filtered softly through the lace curtains, casting embroidered shadows across the floorboards. The aroma of dark roast coffee mingled with the quiet hum of the radio, playing what sounded like an old Gregorian chant, barely audible, like incense for the ears. I sat at the little table near the window, notebook open but untouched. I hadn't written a single word since the cemetery, not because there was nothing to say, but because I didn't yet understand what I had witnessed. I needed context. I needed history. I needed a name to hold on to, beyond an inscription on cold stone. "Excuse me," I said softly, turning to the innkeeper, who was arranging freshly baked bread in a wicker basket. "Do you know who Sister Cécile was?" She paused mid-movement, her hands stilling over the linen cloth. Then she nodded, slowly. "Ah," she said, almost in a whisper. "So, you've seen the tomb?" I nodded. "And the woman?" My breath caught slightly, but I managed to reply, "Yes." She turned toward me then, eyes sharper than before, light brown with flecks of something like amber. "Come," she said, motioning toward a chair across from mine. "I will tell you." Her name was Madeleine, and she had run the guest house for nearly 3 decades, inheriting it from her aunt, who herself had once been a postulant at the old abbey on the hill. "I was never a nun," she said, pouring coffee for both of us. "But I grew up among them. The walls here remember their voices, especially hers." She paused a moment, eyes drifting to a small framed picture on the far wall. It was a black and white photo of a young woman in a habit, standing near a rose bush. Her eyes were soft but steady, lips pressed together in what looked like quiet determination. "That's her?" I asked. Madeleine nodded. "Sir Cécile du Sacré-Cœur, Cécile of the Sacred Heart." "She was so young," I murmured. "She was only 32 when she died," Madeleine replied, folding her hands in her lap. "But her soul, it held centuries of grace." And so she began to tell me the story. Cécile was born in 1912, in a small village just a few kilometers east of Saint Auriel. Her parents were devout Catholics, farmers with calloused hands and generous hearts. From a young age, Cécile showed a depth of compassion that startled those around her. She would sit beside the elderly in church after Mass, holding their hands long after everyone else had left. She wrote prayers in the margins of her school books, and by the time she was 16, she told her parents she wanted to dedicate her life to Christ. They wept, but they understood. She entered the convent of St. Eloy at 18, a stone abbey perched on the hillside with views of the valley and the river below. It had been founded in the 17th century and served as both a place of worship and an orphanage for children displaced by war, famine, or poverty. She had a gift, Madeleine said, not just for prayer, but for presence. Cécile taught the children, tended the gardens, and sang in the chapel with a voice that, according to legend, could silence storms. People came just to hear her read the Psalms. Madeleine added, not for the words, but the way they lingered in the air after she spoke them. Then came the war, in 1942, as the grip of the Nazi occupation tightened across France. The abbey took in a group of Jewish children who had been separated from their families. The nuns risked everything to hide them, using old wine cellars and underground passageways to keep them out of sight. Cécile became their guardian. She refused to leave their side. Madeleine said she slept among them. She taught them songs in Latin. She brushed their hair and whispered stories of saints who endured trials and never stopped loving. But the Gestapo eventually came to the village. A traitor, they say, had whispered the abbey's secret to gain favor. One night in August of 1944, soldiers surrounded the convent. The Mother Superior told the sisters to flee through a hidden path in the orchard. Many obeyed, but Cécile stayed. She locked herself in the crypt with the children. Madeleine said, her voice thickening, She told the others, "They are the Sacred Heart. If I leave them, I leave him." They were found days later. The children were alive, hidden behind a false wall Cécile had constructed with the help of a few older orphans. But she was gone. No one ever found her body, only her rosary, left neatly coiled at the foot of the statue of the Virgin in the chapel. After the war, the people of Saint Auriel petitioned to honor her as a martyr. The Church, cautious as always, never officially canonized her, but among the villagers, and especially the children who had grown up and returned with families of their own, she was a saint. They built her tomb in the convent cemetery, even without a body, a resting place for the soul. Madeleine said, "Not for the bones." Over time, the tomb became a place of quiet pilgrimage. People came not just to mourn, but to seek something: peace, direction, healing. And then the stories began. They say, Madeleine continued, lowering her voice, that on certain days, feast days, All Souls, Easter morning, you can see her. Her, the woman in black, kneeling beside the tomb. She never speaks, she never moves, but those who see her, she leaned in closer. They are often people whose faith is, how do you say, trembling, shaken, my breath caught in my throat. She doesn't appear to everyone, only those who are at a crossroads, a moment of choice, a pause, and those who see her, Madeleine whispered, are never quite the same afterward. I sat back in my chair, the wood creaking beneath me. The weight of the story pressed into my shoulders like wet wool. I didn't know what to say, so I asked, simply, have you seen her? Madeleine smiled, but it wasn't a smile of denial. It is not for me to say, she answered, but I have been in the cemetery on certain mornings when the mist parts in a peculiar way. And I have felt, watched, not in fear, but in prayer. She stood then, smoothing the folds of her apron. Faith, she said, is not always found in miracles. Sometimes it is found in remembering who has already walked the road before you and choosing to keep walking. She left me there with my coffee and the silence of her words. I didn't move for a long while. That afternoon, I visited the abbey. It was no longer in use, at least not officially. The windows were shuttered, the chapel locked, but the exterior was still intact. Ivy curling up the stone like threads pulled by time itself. I stood at the gate, imagining the echoes of children's laughter, the hush of evening vespers, the rustle of habits in the corridor. A wind passed through the trees, and I could have sworn it carried a melody. Soft, familiar, Latin, ubi caritas et amor, Deus ibi est. Where charity and love are, God is there. I stood there until the sky blushed with the first colors of dusk. That night, back in my room, I lit a small candle on the windowsill, not out of ritual, but remembrance. The flame flickered gently, casting shadows across the wooden beams. I opened my notebook and wrote only one sentence. She stayed with the children, even when no one else did. And somehow, those words brought more comfort than I had known in months. Not because they explained anything, but because they reminded me of something I had nearly forgotten. That faith is not always found in the light. Sometimes it kneels quietly in the dark and waits. Chapter 4. The Return in the Rain. Some nights have a breath of their own. You can feel it in the walls, in the floor beneath your feet, in the way your thoughts refuse to settle. That night in St. Auriel, the air in my room felt heavy with something I couldn't name, like a prayer that hadn't yet finished being spoken. I couldn't sleep. The candle I had lit earlier on the windowsill had long since gone out, leaving only the faint scent of melted wax and soot in the air. The town outside had fallen silent. Not a single car passed. Not a single dog barked. Even the crickets had stilled, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I lay awake, staring at the low wooden ceiling, feeling the pulse in my fingertips. And then came the pull. Not a voice, not a dream, but a pull, like a thread being tugged from somewhere deep within me. Without knowing why, I rose from bed, wrapped myself in my coat, and stepped quietly out into the corridor. The floorboards creaked beneath my bare feet, but not loudly enough to wake anyone. I slipped through the front door of the guest house and into the night. And that's when I heard it. The rain. It wasn't heavy, not yet, just a soft, steady drizzle that kissed the rooftops and tickled the leaves, carrying with it the scent of old stone, wet earth, and lavender crushed beneath invisible footsteps. I should have turned back. I had no umbrella. My shoes weren't made for mud, but none of it seemed to matter. Something had awakened in me, or perhaps something was waiting. The path up the hill to the cemetery was darker than I remembered. The cypress trees now looming like tall shadows reaching toward the storm-clouded sky. Mist clung to their trunks, and the ground glistened beneath each dim pool of moonlight that broke through. But I wasn't afraid. Every step felt like a heartbeat. By the time I reached the cemetery gate, my coat was soaked through, and my hair clung to my skin. The gate, once again, stood open. Had it ever been closed? I entered, expecting to find only darkness. But there, at the far end of the graveyard, beside the tomb of Sister Cécile, a candle burned. Its flame swayed in the rain but did not go out. It flickered softly, casting a halo of gold on the wet stone, illuminating the carved name on the tomb like a memory come to life. No one was there. No one should have lit it. Open flames weren't allowed in the cemetery. Madeline had said as much. And yet, it burned. I approached slowly, my boots squelching in the mud. I expected the candle to vanish, to prove itself a trick of light and rain. But it remained, real, warm. A second breath caught in my throat, not from cold, but from something deeper, something reverent, as though I had arrived just moments after a sacred ritual had ended, or just before it would begin again. I knelt beside the tomb, water soaked through the knees of my trousers, and the cold sank into my bones. But I didn't move, I didn't speak, I simply stared at the name. Sister Cécile du Sacré-Cœur, 1912 to 1944. I am with the little ones until the end. And without thinking, my lips began to move. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. The words flowed from me like an old river rediscovered, worn, familiar, sacred. My voice was barely more than a whisper, but in the stillness of that place, it felt loud, too loud. The rain fell steadily, soaking the tomb, the grass. My hands folded before me, and then a hand touched my shoulder. It was warm, not startling, not forceful, just present, firm, gentle, human. I froze, not in fear, but in recognition, like the moment someone calls your name in a crowd, and you realize, somehow, they've known you all along. I turned. There was no one there. The candle still burned. The grave remained still, but the air had changed, subtle, charged, like the space where lightning had just passed but left no scorch. My breath caught, my pulse raced, not from panic, but from awe. The warmth from that touch remained on my shoulder, even as I stood slowly and turned back toward the tomb. And that's when I saw it, lying just beside the stone base of the grave, half hidden in the damp grass. A rosary. It was black, not glossy, polished black, but matte, smooth, worn, the kind of black that comes from time and tears and endless prayer. Each bead was slightly different in shape, as if they had been handmade or passed through thousands of fingers. The crucifix at the end was simple, old, small, silver dulled with age, but it was the kind of cross that bore weight, not just in metal, but in meaning. I reached down and picked it up. The beads were cool against my palm, but not cold. They pulsed with a quiet steadiness, like something alive, and as I held them, I felt something rise in me. Not emotion, not memory, but invitation, as though someone was saying, "Here, take this, it is not forgotten." I stood there for a long time, the rosary cradled in my hand, the rain falling quietly around me. There was no fear, only wonder, only the sense that I had crossed into a place where the veil between this world and the next was thinner than I had ever imagined. A place where prayer was not a sound, but a presence, where names engraved in stone still whispered, where candles burned despite the rain. I didn't speak again. I didn't need to. The silence spoke enough. I pressed the rosary to my chest, tucked it into the pocket of my coat, and stepped back from the tomb. The candle flickered once, then twice. Then, as I turned away, it went out. I left the cemetery with wet shoes and trembling hands. But something inside me felt clearer than it had in years, like the fog of doubt that had clung to me for so long was beginning to lift. Not all at once, but gently, gracefully, one prayer at a time. Back in my room, I laid the rosary on the nightstand beside my bed. I stared at it for a long time, afraid to touch it again, and even more afraid not to. I didn't dream that night, but I woke with the distinct sense that someone had been beside my bed, watching over me, not to scare, not to save, just to keep vigil. Chapter 5. A voice in the silence. There is a kind of silence that doesn't come from the absence of sound, but from the presence of something deeper, something older than words, something that echoes not in the ears, but in the soul. That morning, after the rain had stopped and the sky had softened to a pale silver wash, I found myself walking toward the old Abbey chapel, the one Madeline had said was rarely opened anymore. I didn't even know why I was going. The rosary still lay in the pocket of my coat, heavy like a secret too sacred to name. All I knew was that I needed to be near that place. Not out of curiosity, but reverence. The chapel stood at the edge of the forest, stone walls wrapped in ivy, Its wooden doors arched like praying hands frozen in time. The path leading to it was cracked with age, framed by wildflowers and gnarled roots that seemed to grow in the pattern of a labyrinth. I paused before the doors. There was no sign, no lock, no candlelight behind stained glass to suggest anyone was inside. I reached for the iron handle. It gave way easily, and the door opened with a long sigh of hinges, like something awakening from sleep. The air that greeted me was cool, tinged with old wax and dust, but beneath it all was another scent, frankincense, faint but unmistakable. The inside of the chapel was dim, lit only by soft shafts of sunlight filtering through fractured panes of stained glass. The images were faded now, saints with outstretched hands, angels with broken wings, but the light danced through them still, painting the stone floor with scattered blues and reds. No one else was there. I stepped in slowly, my footsteps muffled by the centuries-old stone beneath. There were wooden pews on either side, many of them warped with time, some bearing names carved in script no longer used. At the far end stood the altar, simple, weathered, sacred. Above it hung a crucifix, Christ's face worn smooth by time, his eyes hollow but somehow still watching. I sat in the third pew from the front, not because I chose it, but because something in me remembered it. And then, the silence began to speak. It didn't come as a voice in the ordinary sense. It came like breath across a mirror, like the echo of prayer that has never stopped. A whisper, soft, female, Latin. I turned my head sharply, instinctively, but there was no one in sight. I held my breath, and the whisper came again. Domini, dirige me, Lord, guide me. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was so faint, I could have imagined it. But it came from the stone, from the walls, from somewhere beneath the layers of history embedded in this place. I pressed my hands together, not in fear, in longing, and then something shifted inside me. It started as a flicker, an image. I was small again, maybe 6 or 7 years old, kneeling beside my mother in the back pew of our parish church back home. Her hand was around mine, gently moving my fingers along her rosary. Her lips were whispering the Hail Mary, and though I didn't understand every word, I whispered too. It was the first time I had prayed, and suddenly, that moment returned to me with piercing clarity. The smell of my mother's perfume, the feel of her cotton scarf brushing my cheek, the warmth of her hand, the candlelight flickering on the altar. I began to cry, without sound, without sobs. The tears just came, and I let them. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes, hours, time unraveled in the stillness, flowing like incense smoke. I prayed without words. I listened without expectation. I simply was. Then I heard the sound of soft footsteps behind me. They didn't startle me. They felt expected, like part of the rhythm of the chapel. I turned, and there, standing at the entrance near the back, was an old priest. He wore a plain black cassock, buttoned to the throat, and a thin white stole draped around his neck. His hair was silver, but his eyes were clear, a striking, ageless blue. He held a small book in his hand and walked with a slight stoop, as though bent from decades of kneeling. He didn't speak right away. He simply nodded once, then slowly made his way toward the altar. I stood as he passed. Instinctively, he turned to me as he reached the front and smiled gently. "You've seen her," he said softly. I blinked. "Who?" "Sister Cécile," he replied. "You wouldn't be here otherwise." I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't have to. He motioned for me to sit, then sat beside me on the pew, the wood creaking gently beneath his weight. "She still prays here," he said, almost as if talking to himself. "Always has, even after they built her tomb." I looked at him, uncertain. "You've heard her?" He nodded. "Heard her, felt her. I've even smelled the rose oil she used to keep in her habit pocket. Especially when I'm about to give up on someone." There was a long pause. Then he continued, "She never left this place." He said, "Not in spirit, not in purpose. She stayed, for the children, for the broken-hearted, for the ones who thought God had forgotten their name." I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. "People come here searching," he went on. "They come with guilt, with grief, with faith worn thin as old cloth. They sit here and sometimes, if their hearts are quiet enough, she reaches them." "How do you know?" I asked. He smiled again, but this time there was something else in it, melancholy, maybe, or memory, "because she reached me," he whispered, "many years ago." He didn't elaborate. He simply reached into his cassock pocket and pulled out a small piece of folded cloth. Wrapped inside was a rosary, just like mine. Black beads, worn, smooth, the same simple silver crucifix. "We are not the first," he said, "and we will not be the last." I stared at the beads, then reached into my coat and pulled out mine. We sat there, the two of us, holding the rosaries as if they were keys to something too vast to name. Then he looked at me, clear and steady. "Whatever you came here seeking," he said, "don't be afraid if the answer comes differently than you expected. Sometimes grace arrives through absence. Sometimes it speaks through silence." He placed his rosary back in the cloth, tucked it into his pocket, and rose to his feet. "I'll leave you to her now," he said, and just like that, he walked out. I remained in the chapel for a long while after he left. The whispering had ceased, but the silence had become deeper, not emptier, just more full. It pressed gently against me, like a blanket pulled up over the shoulders of a weary traveler. I looked once more at the crucifix above the altar, and for the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel alone. Chapter 6. The Pilgrimage of the Heart. Some pilgrimages require no map. There are journeys that begin not with a departure, but with a decision, a quiet turning of the heart. That morning, after the old priest left me alone in the chapel, I sat in silence for a long time. I didn't want to leave. I couldn't. It wasn't because I had more to see. It was because, for the first time in a long while, I realized I had more to offer. I went back to the guest house just before noon. Madeline didn't say a word when I told her I'd be staying a little longer. She just nodded knowingly, as if she'd been expecting it. That afternoon, I returned to the cemetery, not to search, not to wait, but simply to serve. The rain had left the earth damp and pliable. Fallen leaves clung to the bases of the gravestones. Moss crept over the names of those who had been long forgotten. I brought an old rag, a soft bristled brush, and a small bucket filled with warm water and vinegar. I began with the grave of Sister Cécile. The candle from that rainy night had left a faint wax ring on the stone, which I gently cleaned. I swept away the debris, picked out the weeds curling along the edges, and removed the wilted rose. Now brown and brittle, I didn't throw it away. I tucked it into the pages of my notebook, pressed between Psalm chapter 27 and Psalm chapter 42. From there, I moved grave to grave. Each name, each date, each epitaph became part of a rhythm. Scrub, rinse, pray. Some were barely readable. Some had no more than enfant in canoe etched into the stone. But I tended to them all, like brushing the dust from forgotten stories. As I worked, I felt no fear, no more tingling on the back of my neck, no haunted air in the stillness, just peace and purpose. In the evenings, I sat on the bench beside the cemetery gate and read my Bible under the soft light of the setting sun. I didn't rush. I didn't chase answers. I simply turned pages and let the words speak in their own time. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Psalm chapter 34 verse 18. Some nights I read aloud, just barely above a whisper. On others, I closed the book and simply watched the light change, how it moved across the crosses, how it gilded the edge of the sky with gold before slipping away. I began waking earlier. I helped Madeline carry fresh water from the well. I chopped vegetables in the kitchen, fed the cats that wandered in and out of the garden, and hung linens to dry in the quiet morning breeze. Everything I did felt small, and yet nothing felt wasted. This was no longer a visit. It had become a pilgrimage of the heart. The rosary remained on my nightstand. I didn't wear it, nor did I pray with it aloud, but I held it sometimes, especially at night. There was something grounding about it, as if the beads held not only prayer, but memory. And some nights, I swear I could feel a pulse, slow, warm, steady, like a heartbeat not my own. Then came the dream. It was just past midnight when I awoke briefly, the wind having rustled the wooden shutters in my room. I glanced at the clock beside the bed, 12:11 a.m., then settled back beneath the covers and let the darkness take me. And in the dream, I was standing in a garden. It was unlike any place I had seen. The trees were tall and ancient, their trunks glowing faintly as if lit from within. The flowers were of no variety I recognized, translucent petals, soft as breath, and leaves that shimmered in pale hues of blue and silver. The air was warm, fragrant with lavender and myrrh. A gentle mist curled around the path, and somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed once, long, low, and mournful. Then I saw her, Sister Cécile. She stood at the center of the garden, beneath an arch of living vines that bore no thorns. Her face was exactly as in the photograph Madeline had shown me, but alive, luminous, not youthful in the sense of age, but unfaded. She was dressed in her black habit, but her veil shimmered slightly with the same glow as the trees. And in her hands, she held the rosary, my rosary, but it was no longer black. It was white, a radiant pearl white that glowed with light not of this world. She looked at me and smiled. It was not a smile of recognition. It was a blessing. No words passed between us, but I felt them, as clear as breath. You are found. Tears welled in my eyes even in sleep. I dropped to my knees in the dream, not out of fear, but reverence. She raised the rosary in both hands as if offering it, then slowly stepped back, vanishing behind the arch of vines. And the garden was gone. I awoke with a start. The room was still, the moonlight falling in slanted beams across the floor. I sat up, heart pounding, not with panic, but awe. My gaze turned, slowly, to the nightstand. The rosary lay exactly where I had left it. Only now, it was white. I reached for it with trembling fingers. The beads, once matte black, were now a soft ivory sheen. Not polished, not plastic, not new, but gently transformed, as if the color had been washed clean by something unseen. I held it in my palm, running the beads between my fingers, whispering the Our Father. And as I prayed, I didn't ask for answers. I only gave thanks for the silence, for the whispers, for the garden, for her. That morning, I returned to the chapel and lit a single candle at the altar. Not for the dead, but for the living, for those whose hearts still wandered, still wondered, still waited. My pilgrimage had no shrine, no relic, no certificate of completion. Only this, a heart that had once been lost, and now knew what it meant to be seen. Chapter 7. She was there for me. The morning I left St. Auriel, the world felt quieter than usual. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from absence, but rather from fullness, like the air had been steeped in something ancient and holy. And now it simply rested. The clouds floated low and thin across the pale blue sky, and the wind barely stirred the lavender fields on the edge of town. I had packed my bag the night before, folded everything neatly, even placed the white rosary in a small velvet pouch that I kept close to my chest. It felt wrong to hide it at the bottom of a suitcase, as if it belonged not to me, but to something beyond me. Madeline made me tea instead of coffee that morning. She didn't ask why I had extended my stay, nor why I was leaving now. She didn't mention Sister Cécile or the cemetery. She just placed the teacup in front of me, wrapped her hands around mine, and said one thing: "You will carry her with you." I didn't speak. I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't know how to explain what had happened. I didn't fully understand it myself, but I had stopped needing to understand. I had learned to believe. Before heading to the station, I walked once more toward the cemetery, not as a habit, not even as a farewell, but because I knew, without question, that she was waiting. The road up the hill was just as I had left it. The trees stood in quiet reverence, their leaves dappled in morning light. The iron gate was still open, as if the space between worlds had never closed. I stepped inside. The moment my foot touched the grass, something settled inside me, like a soft hand pressing gently against my heart, reminding me, this is sacred ground. No one else was there. The cemetery was still, only the soft sound of wind through the cypress, the distant hum of a morning bell from the abbey far behind me. I walked slowly, reverently, toward Sister Cécile's tomb, and then I saw her. She was standing just beyond the gravestone, the same woman in black, draped in shadow, yet glowing, still, calm, unmoved by time. But this time, I wasn't afraid to meet her eyes. They were not sorrowful. They were not distant. They were kind. She looked at me with such depth, such quiet knowing, that my knees almost gave way. But I stayed upright, not out of strength, but because she was holding me there with her gaze. Then, very gently, she nodded, a small gesture, barely a motion, and yet it said everything. I see you. I know. It is enough. She turned then, slowly, and began to walk down the narrow row between graves, her veil brushing the edges of the rosemary bushes. I watched her move, not floating, not fading, but walking, as if the earth beneath her still welcomed each step. She passed through the line of trees, the morning sunlight catching the folds of her habit, and just as she reached the edge where light met shade, she was no longer there. No sound, no flash, no vanishing act, just gone, like breath released from lips, like mist touched by light. I stood there a long while after that, long enough for the sun to rise higher, long enough for the stillness to fold itself gently around me one last time. And I realized then, deep in the quiet space of my soul, that I hadn't come to St. Auriel by accident. I had been called, not loudly, not suddenly, but faithfully. Something in me had broken, yes, but something in her had reached across the veil, across time and space, and whispered me home. She had been there for me. I walked slowly back down the hill, my shoes damp with dew, my heart strangely light. At the bottom of the path, just before the bend, I turned for one last glance. The cemetery stood in full view, bathed in golden morning light. The tombstones glistened with dew. The bench near the gate sat in its usual spot, empty now, but somehow not alone. And though no figure stood there, I felt her presence, strong, gentle, ever watchful. When I boarded the train that morning, I didn't look back, not because I was trying to forget, but because I had been changed. The kind of change that doesn't need proof or explanation. The kind that happens when you have seen a mystery with your own eyes. When you've felt grace move through your hands like prayer. When you've stood in the presence of someone who belongs to heaven and knows your name. I sat by the window, the rosary in my lap, the pouch warm against my palm, and as the train pulled away from St. Auriel, I closed my eyes and whispered the only thing left to say: thank you. She was never just a ghost. She was a presence, a prayer, a soft echo of something sacred that refused to be forgotten. Now, back in my ordinary world of train stations and emails, apartment keys and grocery lists, there are moments when I find myself still listening for her. For the hush she brought, the silence that somehow said more than words ever could. It's hard to explain to others what happened in St. Auriel. I've tried. I've started sentences and stopped halfway through. I've watched eyes grow curious, then politely distant, because to speak of seeing a woman in black who might not have been flesh and blood, to admit I now carry a white rosary that changed color overnight, well, it doesn't fit easily into conversation. But that's the thing about miracles. They rarely care about fitting in. I don't need to understand everything that happened. What matters is this: I was found, not in the way I expected, not by answers or doctrines or thunder from heaven, but by a quiet woman kneeling at a grave, by a candle that refused to go out in the rain, by a dream where the veil was lifted just enough to see the shape of grace. Faith didn't return to me in fire. It returned like dew on morning grass, like a whisper in an empty chapel, like someone standing just behind you, placing a hand on your shoulder, not to push or pull, but simply to remind you, I'm still here. Sister Cécile never left that place. But more than that, she never left those who needed her. She stayed for the lost, for the wandering, for those who didn't even know what they were searching for. And on that last morning, she was there for me. She was never just a ghost. She was a reminder that love never leaves the tomb, and faith is never truly lost, only waiting to be found again. I don't know where you are as you listen to this. Maybe your heart is full of belief. Maybe it's full of doubt. Maybe you're somewhere in between. Wherever you are, I hope this story touched something quiet inside you. If it did, then perhaps she was there for you. 2. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. John chapter 14 verse 1. Thank you for walking with me through this story. If you feel drawn to journeys like this, of quiet miracles, sacred mystery, and glimpses of the divine, I invite you to subscribe to Fogman Stories. We don't shout, we whisper, and in that whisper, we listen for what might still be waiting for us in the silence. Until next time, may peace find you, may love remain, and may you always remember, you are not alone. The woman at the tomb shared with faith and tenderness.